Okay, so hi and welcome to the next episode of the $5 million project. In this one, what I'm going to talk about is how we took the idea, the agreement that we were going to do something, and tried to move it forward to a point where we could actually start putting some code together and building the product. We have shareholders, we've got a clear idea of investment, we've got a little bit of an understanding of some of the returns that we can expect off the back of the investment, and we've got a team together that we can actually work with. Looking back, this was definitely the most frustrating part of the whole project to date, for me personally anyway. And I think the main reason for this is control, or lack of. Because it was outside of my expertise, I hadn't done this sort of thing before, I didn't really know the best way to go about it. I didn't know how to make progress. So what it meant for me was I would have to sort of learn by failure. So I'd try something, it wouldn't work, we'd try another angle, that wouldn't work, until we got to a point where something would work and we'd see a bit of progress. And it wasn't as bad as it sounds, but for me, I really didn't enjoy how slow it was and how much time was being wasted on things that weren't necessary. Like, I was doing work, maybe a couple of weeks into something, with the niggling thought in my mind of, hey, this might not be the best way of going about it, but I've got to do it because I've got to try to see whether that actually gets us somewhere. So the first thing to talk through is the sort of scope of work. And off the back of the meeting in August, the development team had gone away, well, predominantly the BA, and outlined everything we discussed and sent it back to me in a document that covered a little bit of detail around these things. And you can see it on your screen now. What we're effectively looking at is who the audience is, like who the key users of the platform are going to be, what the process flows are, so how people will interact and go through the various touch points in here, some of the actual specific functionality. So we've got things like campaigns, we've got things like just having a basic dashboard with results on and that side of things. And if we go a little bit further down in the document, you start getting into areas where we're talking about the resources that are actually required to deliver this product. So here we've got BAs, testers, lead developers, project managers. All of that for me was very, very helpful, but at the same time, it was a long, long way off being accurate. So there was, maybe 15-20% of this document that felt about right, and the rest was way off. So in my mind, I knew the resources that were being scoped here were probably not going to be sufficient to deliver what we actually need from a product perspective. But I think on reflection, although it was frustrating to get something back that wasn't as good as I would like it to have been, it was based on one meeting. And more than anything, it gave me a foundation. It gave me something to work from, which meant I could start putting some meat on the bones and really building it out in my own way to help articulate what we were trying to do. Off the back of the meeting we'd had in August, we'd booked another meeting with what was going to be the board, or eventually ended up being the board of people from the various different stakeholders. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to discuss things like the shareholdings, the level of investment required, some of the financial projections, just a rough idea, how we were going to move things forward, from the project scope that we had, and maybe a little bit of conversation around some minor details like, what accounting software were we going to use, where were we actually going to incorporate the company itself. So you can see on the screen here, these are the actual minutes from the board meeting itself, where we outlined the discussion points and what was covered here. A couple of things that were brought to the meeting. So Mike had gone away and he'd done some loose financial projections or cost projections, I guess you should say, in terms of how much he thought the actual product would take cost to build. Now that was obviously based on the product scope that I'd initially received, and Mike's understanding based on the meeting that we'd all been in August. But it gave us enough of an understanding that, okay, to develop this product, we're going to need X amount of money. Now, once we go live, I had produced a document that outlined roughly some of the revenue or the revenue streams that I thought we'd be able to get and the levels of revenue. So we then knew how much money we needed to develop and how much money we needed to keep us going until the product's bringing in enough money to be self-sufficient. So what I've done on the screen here is I've just pulled in the financial projection document that I produced. You can see it's very, very basic. There's a couple of tabs, which is year 1, year 2, year 3. And then all I've done is I've looked at some different variables. So variables in terms of how much we're selling the licenses for, and then variables for how many licenses we sell on a monthly basis. Because it is that simple. If you sell more, or if you sell more at a higher price, then you generate more in monthly recurring revenue. And you can see on the tabs here that as we get into year 3, we're getting the business to a point where it could be generating, $300,000 plus a month in recurring revenue. So we knew that there was the opportunity to generate a lot of money off the back of something successful like this. But at the same time, based on Mike's cost projections, we knew that we were going to need a lot of money up front and for the first 6 to 12 months of sales before we were at a point where we were self-sufficient. So none of us were naive to the fact that we'd be able to bootstrap this or do it cheap, because it was simply too big of an ask to be able to put this together and take it to market. Off the back of that meeting, my job, and it had been going sort of in the background between the meeting anyway, was to continue working on this scope. And really what I was trying to do was I was trying to add some meat to the bones for the project team, for the development team, so they could more clearly understand actually what this thing did. So I spent a long while going through and looking at things like the specific audiences, exactly which type of candidate, whether it's a candidate on the database, whether it's a candidate that hasn't engaged with the business before, and each one of those audiences, how they would interact with our product, how we would actually reach them, how they would engage with it, and therefore how that would add value to the recruitment agency itself. So I broke it down into that level of granular detail and looked at each one of those audiences and looked at their flows and engagement with the product itself. I thought it was finished. I thought at this point, hey, there's enough here for the team to be able to understand it. And then naively, we might be able to move into that development process. One of the single biggest learns for me was, looking back, there's no way that development team could actually start developing based on simply an outline of how people would interact with the product and how it would actually work. It needed to go into the granular level of detail. If I send an email, how do I make sure that when someone takes an action, it sends another email? You need an email tool, you need some level of automation in there. We can't just talk about machine learning, we actually need to talk about the specifics of how the algorithms are built. How does the platform learn? What information is available that the platform can learn from? So all that level of detail was needed, and I think that became a lot more apparent to me over the next probably 3 or 4 months of going back and forth. So once this document was back to the development team, we then go through sort of another couple of week period of them reviewing it and trying to interpret it and put their words around it. And more for your amusement than anything else, if you can see the screen here, this is the response I got back, with lots and lots of edits and questions and annotations and all that side of things. And at this point, I realized this process isn't working. This is not the best way to get this thing scoped. It's simply too complex, and the team just doesn't understand, the development team doesn't understand the industry or the challenge or anything that we're trying to solve. So I called a meeting and I said, right, we need to get together with the development team and we need to go through basically what I went through in August again, and to try and build on top of the bones that we had there. So we had the meeting. I ran a similar meeting to August, but in more detail at every point, showing platforms that did parts of what we were looking to do, trying to show real life examples. And then we recorded that, and that meeting notes was disseminated amongst the team so they could all get a better idea of where we were heading. I thought that might be sort of our magic bullet, our solution to the problems we were having. The reality was it wasn't. We continue going back and forth in a very similar manner without a huge amount of progress. And at this point, we initially, at the end of August was the first meeting. We're now sort of getting into December. And for me, there's been other delays because various people, including myself, have been away and overseas and working on other things. But the level of progress is frustratingly slow. So we did a couple of things. So number one was to implement bi-weekly board meetings. where we would hold each other a bit more accountable for progress. Because we'd all been sort of away and doing other things, by knowing we had to attend these meetings, it meant that every person who was involved had to show some degree of progress on what they were doing. So all the external factors became less relevant because we were, again, accountable. And the other thing I did was I started trying to articulate the recruitment ecosystem for the development team and the board, so that everyone was clear on how the whole of the technology sector behind the recruitment industry actually fitted together. So we looked at stuff like how candidates are sourced, how the websites where candidates might bump into the recruitment agency, how the database works, how CVs are sent into the database, how reference checks are carried out. All that sort of information was put in here, so that we could see exactly where our product would fit in the middle of this puzzle. So we started the bi-weekly meetings. But at this point, we're getting very, very close to Christmas. So although there's progress being made, we quickly realized that what we needed to do was we needed another face-to-face meeting. And if we'd have all been in the same location, this would have probably happened a lot more regularly. But it was tricky because everyone was in different locations. But we booked one in for the earliest time we could possibly find, which was sort of late January by that time because of Christmas and travel plans and that side of things. So knowing we had a meeting booked in for late January, and that was another whole day session that we were going to do, really my focus then became trying to document as much information that hadn't already been documented, so that I could go into that meeting and present not a pitch, but a detailed overview of the product to that group, so that I could get questions and feedback on what we were looking to build and see whether they had any different views on that. And I think one of the key things here is, at this stage, what we're looking to build has changed quite dramatically from what it was in August, just based on the last 2 or 3 months of circling around and going back and forth through things. So even though I felt that there's been a lot of wasted time going on, it has actually meant that we've ended up with a far better product idea than we initially had. If we'd have gone quickly, I don't think that would have happened. I think we'd have pushed forward with exactly what we had before, and we'd have missed a lot of opportunities to develop something that's even better than we initially thought it was going to be. So concurrently with this, I was also working on brand, the company name, the domain registrations and those types of things. And they're a lot more in my comfort zone. So I found that side of things a lot easier. And in the next session, I'll walk you through some of those areas, because even though it's in my comfort zone, there's definitely a lot of learns, a lot of things that may help someone else that's setting up a business in terms of how to do that relatively efficiently. But before I do that, one other sort of takeaway from this whole thing, my biggest view in terms of why we went in circles for such a long period is because everyone was too nice to each other. We were all in a new relationship. We all wanted to get on with each other. We all wanted to be friends. But because of that, we were slower in saying, hey guys, this isn't working. We need to stop this. I don't agree with this. We need to do this in this way. And if we had been prepared to be a little bit more sort of strong-willed, a little bit more sort of in control or opinionated, I think we would have had more powerful and meaningful conversations at an earlier stage, which would have skipped maybe a month or two of that circling around. So my advice to myself and anyone else that finds himself in a new relationship with stakeholders is, when you're setting those expectations, when you're meeting together at those first stages, I think talk about what each of you are happy to have and the level of tolerance for feedback and people to push you. Because if you're clear on that in an early stage, it gives you a lot more authority to do that, which should enable a little bit more progress.